Hey y'all, it's Mr. Gonzalez, and this is the second installment in my 5-part lesson on the United States and its involvement in World War II. In this installment, we're going to look at the causes of the war and the reasons for American involvement. So while Mussolini and Hitler are coming to power in Europe and militarism and nationalism are starting to emerge in Japan, the United States is withdrawing back into its old tradition of isolationism. Now, for most of its existence, the United States had been an isolationist country. This is a tradition that goes back to George Washington. In his farewell address, he warned the American people not to get involved in the affairs of other countries. And for the most part, the United States had followed this advice. The only real exception was America's involvement in World War I. And by the start of the 1920s, most Americans had considered this a mistake. They felt that the United States should not have gotten involved in World War I and should have left Europe to take care of itself. Throughout the 1920s, the United States signs a series of treaties that really underscore this idea that we're going back to our roots as an isolationist country. The Washington Naval Conference was hosted in Washington, D.C. by the administration of President Warren G. Harding. And in this agreement, the United States and 9 other countries had agreed to shrink the size of their navies. Now, if you remember back from the time period that the United States was becoming a world power, you'll remember that Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan had argued that if you want to be a world power, you have to have a strong navy. Well, here the United States is shrinking the size of its navy. So, obviously, we were not planning on being very involved in the affairs of other countries. The Four-Power Treaty was an agreement between the United States, Great Britain, France, and Japan. And those 4 countries agreed that they would not seize territory in Asia. As we'll see very shortly, Japan is going to go back on its word on that one. And the Kellogg-Briand Pact essentially declared war to be an international crime. So it more or less outlawed war. Did not look like the United States was planning on going to war with anybody anytime soon. In 1935, 1936, and 1937, the United States Congress passed a series of neutrality acts, which prohibited the United States from selling weapons to any country that was at war. It prohibited the U.S. from loaning money to nations at war. It prohibited Americans from traveling to nations that were at war, and even prohibited Americans from traveling on ships owned by countries that were at war. Meanwhile, both Japan and Germany were moving toward war. In Asia, Japan invaded a Chinese province known as Manchuria, and some historians will even argue that the first shots of World War II were not fired in Poland, they were fired in Manchuria. I do not necessarily agree with that, but it's interesting to think about. What's also interesting is that the invasion of Manchuria was carried out by the Japanese military without the support, permission, or authority from the Japanese government. They basically did this against the wishes of the government. The problem was the people of Japan supported this. So the Japanese government more or less had to go along with it. 6 years after Japan invaded Manchuria, they launched in 1937 a full-scale invasion of China. They captured the Chinese city of Beijing, they captured Shanghai, and they captured Nanking. They overran a very large portion of China. when they captured Nanking, the Japanese soldiers went on a 6-week murdering and raping spree. It's estimated that they murdered somewhere between 100 and 300,000 Chinese citizens and raped somewhere around 20,000 Chinese women, most of them who were killed afterwards. So not only have they invaded China, but they are conducting very unspeakable atrocities along the way. Meanwhile, in Europe, Hitler is working on expanding the nation of Germany. I mentioned in the last installment that Hitler believed the Germans were the descendants of the Aryans, and that if the German people were going to survive, any undesirable elements had to be removed. Hitler also believed that the Aryans needed space to grow. So Hitler believes in race and space, in other words. So in 1936, Hitler sent soldiers into the Rhineland. This was a portion of Germany that lay west of the Rhine River. In other words, it was the part of Germany that borders France. According to the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was not supposed to have soldiers in this area. This was a demilitarized zone. So, by sending troops into the Rhineland, Hitler was violating the Treaty of Versailles. And France allowed him to do it. They did not try to stop him. 2 years later, now this probably gave Hitler a little bit of courage to take his next step. In 1938, Germany threatened to invade Austria and demanded that Austria be allowed to, or they demanded that Austria allow Germany to annex it. They do. Now, why does Hitler want Austria? Because Austria is 100% German. He is trying to bring all German people within the boundaries of a single nation. Later that same year, Hitler demanded a portion of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland. Now, this was also an area that was populated by Germans. This was a portion of Germany that had been taken away by the Treaty of Versailles. When Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, who at that time was a guy named Neville Chamberlain, agreed to meet with Hitler in the German city of Munich. The President of France came along as well, and they agreed to allow Hitler to have the Sudetenland. In return, Hitler could not demand any more territory. This is known as the policy of appeasement. They are trying to give Hitler what he wants, hoping that he'll stop. And they believe that he will. When Neville Chamberlain got back to Britain, he held up the treaty that had been signed by Hitler and declared, "We shall have peace in our time." And we all know that he was dead wrong on that. After getting the Sudetenland, Hitler demands this area known as the Polish Corridor. Now, you'll notice on the map that Germany was divided into two sections. You had the main body of the German nation, but then you also had this little section known as East Prussia, and it was separated by a piece of territory that belonged to Poland. Great Britain and France both refused to give it to Hitler and said that if he attempted to take it, they would declare war. So Hitler prepared for war. A week before invading Poland, Hitler signed a treaty with the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, and this is known as the Non-Aggression Pact. This was not an alliance. They simply agreed that they would not go to war with each other. They agreed that they would split Poland down the middle, but the two nations would remain on peaceful terms. 1 week later, on September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland using a new form of warfare known as Blitzkrieg, which is German for lightning war. He used tanks. His goal was to move as quickly as possible and to avoid the long, drawn-out battles that had taken place during World War I. And it works amazingly. Poland it falls in about a month. So Hitler, with some help from the Soviet Union, is able to capture the entire country of Poland in about a month. The following spring, and I should add, after the invasion of Poland, Great Britain and France do declare war on Germany. The following spring, Hitler invades France. France is caught off guard, and it is conquered in 6 weeks. Paris is captured, and it will remain under Nazi control for the next 4 years. Once Hitler has captured France, he turns his attention to Great Britain. Now, Great Britain has the advantage of being an island, so it's much more difficult for Hitler to reach Great Britain than it was for him to reach Poland or France. He begins planning an invasion of Great Britain, which is codenamed Operation Sea Lion. But before he carries out this invasion, he tries to bomb Britain into surrendering. And this results in the Battle of Britain. You have the German Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, fighting the Royal Air Force, or RAF, over London and across the nation of Great Britain for the next several months. And eventually Hitler backs down. He continues bombing Great Britain for months on end. But in the summer of 1941, his attention is drawn away and he invades the Soviet Union. He breaks his non-aggression pact with Stalin and invades Russia. This is usually considered to be his greatest mistake. He waits too late in the year to invade. He invades in June. Russia is a big country. Blitzkrieg does not work as well on a country the size of Russia. He manages to get within a few miles of Moscow, but winter begins to set in, and the Russian army starts to push back the German army. The largest battle in the Russian campaign will take place at Stalingrad, the largest and the most important. And in a battle that lasts for about 6 months, the Germans are defeated and will eventually be pushed back into Germany by the Russian army. Meanwhile, the United States is starting to move away from isolationism and toward involvement. In 1939, when the war first begins, the U.S. Congress passes a cash and carry policy in which it becomes legal to provide military supplies to a nation that is at war as long as they can pay for it in cash and can carry it away on their own ships. In 1941, Congress passes the Lend-Lease Act, which states the United States can sell or lease military supplies to countries that are considered essential to the defense of the United States. And the Atlantic Charter was an agreement that was signed by both President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, which stated that all people around the world should have self-determination, there should be free trade, free navigation of the seas, and it's essentially condemning condemning Germany for its invasion and a takeover of other countries.